Aaron and Victor and I have met for several hours in conversation, in prayer, as we prepared for this Sunday during the month of mental health awareness. There are congregations of various faiths around our country today who are recognizing this weekend mental health awareness, Saturday and Sunday. According to the National Institute for Mental Health, more than 1 in 5 adults live with a mental health illness. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. When you're at the grocery store, you might count and wonder, right? We live with it. These aren't acute episodes, but ongoing conditions. It's just part of the scenery of one's life. 1 in 7 children and teens have at least one treatable mental disorder. So next time you pass a playground, you might count and wonder and have compassion. Increased stress from academic and extracurricular pressures, which I do not recognize elementary school these days. The impact of social media, the lingering effects of the pandemic, those are just some of the reasons. Then there's bullying, family dysfunction, trauma, and neglect that happen in many children's lives. Over half of adults with a mental illness do not receive treatment. Almost 50% of children with mental disorders do not receive necessary treatment. Behind all of these numbers, these statistics, are people. They're people with stories, with fears, and with hopes and dreams. Behind these statistics are families struggling to find treatment and support, individuals left without a place to turn. Mental distress is a contributing factor to homelessness. Many unsheltered people don't end up unsheltered because of drugs or alcohol. Some do, but a lot don't. They end up using because they are unsheltered. And maybe you're wondering, oh golly, what can I do about it? It's a huge problem. It is a huge problem. The call of Christ is first for us to have compassion, I believe, for ourselves when we may be suffering, and for other people who are suffering. We must leave judgment on the floor where it belongs. When we see someone having trouble, leave it on the floor and tap into the compassion that's already in your heart. And be curious about why is there such a gap in accessibility to mental health care? We know there's a gap in physical care, right? Just go to an emergency room. But it's even worse for mental health care. And we need to know why. We need to understand why that is. Read about mental health conditions, which are medical, and they are physical as well. We kind of think that they're separate, but they're really not. Gain an understanding of different mental health disorders and conditions, and understand their causes and their treatments. Learn about appropriate ways to listen and accompany someone who's dealt with or who is managing a mental condition. A lot of times, good-hearted people want to fix things and they give advice. And it's a lot better to listen and just be with somebody. We give a lot of grace to people suffering if they come in with a broken leg or we hear they have cancer. Yeah, a lot of sympathy. And chronic physical conditions. But the church really it's only been in the last 20 years that I've noticed that we are bringing mental illness and well-being out of the shadows of shame and finding ways to bring it into the light of compassion and kindness. It's not just up to professionals either, like Mike and I, pastors. Oh, the pastors will handle that. No. Or the chaplain. Let's call Aaron chaplain or social worker Victor, and they'll fix it, and we don't have to pay attention to it. No. It's not just up to us. It's up to all of us as the body of Christ, to increase our collective capacity to hold space for people when they are hurting, no matter what the source of that pain may be. I can't tell you how many times I've heard someone tell me when they haven't been to church, after a death or something difficult, and, I can't come to church. I'll just sit there and cry. It breaks my heart. If there is any other place in the world that we should feel comfortable or at least willing to shed a few tears, I would hope to God that it's in a sanctuary like this one, where we learn to hold space for people who are hurting, and because sometimes it might be us.
I'm not going to be afraid of the microphone this time. Fear not. The double-edged sword of receiving a diagnosis for mental illness and or any of the other neurodiverse flavorings, because not all neurodiversity is mental illness. It's a broad spectrum, as one might imagine. But as I said, the double-edged sword of getting a diagnosis is that suddenly a lot of your past actions and responses and thought patterns make a lot more sense. And you're able to kind of like look back at your life and think, oh, that's why I did that thing and reacted that way. And then the other half of that is that you also realize how much you've been missing out on while your brain was trying to like self-destruct and you were just trying to survive. I'm 31 years old, and I did not start to feel mostly present in my own life until only about a few years ago, when I finally worked out the right combination of medications to treat my OCD, ADHD, and PMDD. Does anyone know what those are? Some people are nodding, some people are shaking their heads. So OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder. ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And PMDD is premenstrual dysphoric disorder. I'm just full of disorders. It gives me my special flavoring. But the catalyst to me even getting to this point where, as I said, I've started to feel more present in my life really started about 10 years back when I had my first mental health crisis in about 2014, 2015. And as I said, once you get a diagnosis, you start looking at your life and going, aha, these brain buddies have been with me this whole time. But sometimes it just takes the right combination of factors to actually make them blossom and bloom. And for me, that was when I was around 20 years old. And it got to a point where the ever-present sense of doom I was feeling, and the intrusive thoughts about harming myself, and the fact that I couldn't really sleep because I would wake up anxious, and I couldn't really eat because I was so nauseous because I was anxious, and I couldn't drive because I was so anxious and nauseous and all of these things. So it coalesced into a trip to the emergency room. And as I said, the reason I chose Psalm 55 was because that despair really characterizes where I was during that period of my life. I also wanted to be like a dove and fly away and escape outside of my brain where it was quiet, or I could finally have some peace for once. And many people find that concerning, and it is. And so the ER connected me with a crisis intervention counselor, and from there I began my journey with therapy and medication. And as I said, it took about 10 years to get to a place where I was like properly medicated and properly therapized. But just to go back to where we were at the beginning portion here, I was a junior in college at this point. My crisis really boiled over during winter break. And so I went back to school for the spring semester feeling a little bit wobbly. I did my undergrad at the College of William and Mary, and one of the super fun things about that is when I would tell people that, oh yeah, I got into William and Mary, they'd say, I hear that has the highest suicide rate. because I don't know how true it is, but we were a whole school of like perfectionistic overachievers who had to succeed at all costs and had no grace for ourselves, and the system didn't always either. So whenever I told people I got in there, it would be a combination of, oh, I didn't get in there, or I hear that school has the highest suicide rate. There was no in between. So as you might imagine, I was very worried about being a statistic with that kind of context in place. So as I said, I went back to school, I met with my academic advisor and was like, I need to drop a class. And she was like, go for it, do what you need to do, which I really appreciated. And then I began the slow process of constructing a support system, and this was very difficult. I've included, Sarah has included, in the bulletin, on one of the inserts, a handy chart about behaviors to avoid and behaviors to embrace when you're supporting someone with a mental illness or someone who's in crisis. I don't know if I'll hit all of them, but two of the ones that I did really want to emphasize is that part of what made this process so difficult is that, one, I was made to feel like an inconvenience by the people in the systems who were supposed to be helping me, and two, a lot of very well-intentioned, loving people tried to use the Bible as tech support in ways that were not comforting. So for the first of these behaviors, I went back to school, talked with my academic advisor, and then I had tried to find a therapist. And this did not go well. Finding a therapist is very difficult. It has to be a match between you and the therapist. They have to treat what you're hoping they treat. You have to have a good personality vibe, and this therapist and I just weren't it. And so I went to my school's counseling center, hoping that I could get connected that way. But I had been told that in order to really be taken seriously there, you had to tell them it was an emergency, which in and of itself is very problematic. So I did go there. I was talking with the receptionist. She had an incredibly bored / mildly annoyed tone the entire time. And so I finally said, she had asked, is this an emergency? And I had said, yes, it is. And she was like, okay, well, if it's an emergency then. And so that dismissiveness, I still remember to this day. And I did speak to a counselor that day, but then they told me that, they really preferred to treat people who could be solved within 2 semesters. And since I was beyond what they felt that they could, factory reset in 2 semesters, they were going to refer me to an outside partner, which to their credit, they did. She was lovely. Her name was Joan. She and I hung out for the rest of the time I was in school till I graduated. So that does have a happy ending. But to get to that point was a lot of being made to feel like there was something very wrong with me in some ways, which several other people I've talked to who also have mental illness will say, yeah, some therapists made me feel like I was a freak until I found the right one. And that's difficult. It shouldn't be that way. And so then, as I said, during this time, several well-meaning people had been sending me Bible passages from the oldies but goodies about anxiety and big bad feelings. And the thing about mental illness is that the bad thoughts are not your choice. They're just something your brain naturally comes up with on its own because it's so creative. And so being told to rub some Philippians 4:8 on it and then, followed up with a nice relaxing soak in Matthew 6:25-34, because don't worry about anything. God takes care of the flowers and the birds, and so what are you worrying about? Don't worry about it. Just let go and let God, which is a phrase that makes my skin crawl to this day. And so while I know that the people who texted me these, the friends and family members, were extremely well-intentioned, they did not mean it to be interpreted this crassly by me, but it didn't hit the mark. It made me angry. It was kind of would that I could think about good and noble and beautiful things all the time, and yet. And so God may have created, and in fact did create, the scientists who formulated the antidepressants that get me through this day, but I have not found that Bible verses on their own are capable of rectifying any issues with my serotonin or dopamine or hormone levels, just on their own. And so what was instead vastly more meaningful to me during this time, and where I did find and feel like I was being cared for by God, was in the way that my campus ministry just stepped up to help me in practical ways. So at this time, I didn't have a car, and my campus minister and a friend from Wesley, the campus ministry, her mom took turns driving me to therapy every week. It was very nice. Her car smelled delightful. She was a fun little conversation partner. And then on the campus ministry side, we dedicated 3 weeks to talking about faith and mental health. And it was great because then I found other people who were like, oh yes, me too. My brain also does that horrible thing, and yet I am here. And so it was that solidarity and that community of support and compassion that really made the difference for me during that healing journey, because I was really hoping for, a dramatic moment, as we all are, and wasn't finding it, but I was instead gradually accumulating these very ordinary moments of care, which ultimately were what helped heal me. And it was during this point, and that, I've talked about it before in sermons, this is like my origin story of where God's presence began to be more important to me than God's power, and where Jesus' humanity began to be more important to me than his divinity. And as I said, the passage I read from Luke that depicts Jesus like overwhelmed with anxiety is one of my favorites for this reason, because it does actually give me a scriptural visual of, okay, yes, this is something that even Jesus experiences as well. And when it comes to stories of healing and even the word healing, we really expect like great grand miracles that go from A to B, of like broken to fixed. But we don't really hear about the chronic stories of maybe healing doesn't look like being fixed. And that's often hard for us to wrap our minds around. As I said, I've never experienced a dramatic moment where I suddenly had a different brain and a different body that could regulate itself better, but I have experienced healing in the gradual accumulation of just moments of care that help me to survive better in the body and brain that I already have. And that's what healing and wellness are about, is about helping us live well in the circumstances that we already have, and addressing the systems that make it impossible when we can't do that. So I'm currently in what my therapist calls the maintenance phase, because chronic illness is just like every other mental illness is just like every other chronic illness, and that it's always there. It never goes away. Sometimes you notice it more than others. Sometimes it really impairs your functioning, like this morning when I was having a full ADHD moment of running around my apartment because I have a lack of structure. And then other moments, you just kind of keep going through life. And it's all made possible by having a good support system and a good care team. And so, as I said, I'm in the maintenance phase where my symptoms are still present but don't significantly impair my functioning or my ability to live my life. I have my medication trifecta, as I call it for myself, that works well, that my psychiatrist helps me manage. I meet with my individual therapist every few weeks. I have my therapy group of other lovely people who have OCD who I meet with every week on Monday nights. And these are all as routine parts of my life as going to the grocery store, or coming to church, or taking my allergy medicine. And, I love them all. These structures are what have allowed me to thrive. And so when considering how to create environments in which all are able to thrive, even us crazies, I invite us to leave the fix-it verses behind. Like, they have very good context in which can be used well, but instead just kind of refocus on the classic of what does it mean to love our neighbors as ourselves. During my meeting with my crisis intervention counselor, in the immediate aftermath of my trip to the ER, she had me fill out this questionnaire, which if anyone has ever been through mental health counseling, you also have to fill out this questionnaire about how much you hate yourself, or how anxious you are, or how close you are to dying by suicide. And one of the questions was also about how much, why do you hate yourself? And I remember her saying to her, I don't hate myself, I just don't know how to love myself. And if you're similarly unsure of how to love yourself, and likely your neighbors by extension, I highly recommend letting go and letting God help you find a good therapist.
All day, staring at the ceiling, making friends with shadows on my wall. All night, hearing voices telling me that I should get some sleep, because tomorrow might be good for something. Hold on, feeling like I'm heading for a breakdown. And I don't know why, but I'm not crazy, I'm just a little unwell. I know that right now you can't tell, but stay a while, and maybe then you'll see a different side of me. The lyrics of this song capture what I was feeling about 20 years ago. I was in a very difficult place. There were some major changes going on in my life, and I felt out of control, like I wasn't myself. And so finally, I decided that I would shame myself and go to therapy. Just listen to the word I use. I'm shaming myself to go to therapy. So, I knew that something was not well, so I needed to go. And so, guess what I felt when my therapist said, "Victor, have you ever considered medication?" I said, no medication for me. Right? No way, Jose, I can handle this. But after seeing that things were not changing, I decided, well, you know what? I'm going to try these meds. I will see where they take me. I noticed the change in a few weeks. I felt that I was stable and that I was, our thoughts affect our behaviors and our actions and our also and our feelings. So by taking the medication, I knew that I was much better. However, the shame that I felt about being in therapy and taking medications was still there. And so, you know what, I think sometimes I feel cursed. I come from the Mexican tradition. We're very macho and we're gonna take care of these things. So we're gonna figure out how to do this. And I'm a man, I'm gonna deal with this. So I think part of that was I said, because I was feeling better because of the medication, I said, I'm going to see if I can manage this without the meds. And so I started exercising. I continued my therapies, and I also started going to support groups. And then I made that decision that I was going to go off the meds. Okay, and so, but look at all the things that I was doing at that moment, the support systems that I was creating for myself because I was on that medication. But I was able to come off of it. However, the idea that depression is caused by a simple chemical imbalance is misleading. Instead, it's a complex condition with multiple potential causes, including brain function issues, genetics, and life stressors. Signs of depression also vary among different groups of people and can be influenced by race, gender, and culture. What's more, our friendships, our loves, our setbacks, and our stresses can also influence our mental health. While brain chemicals do play a role, they interact in highly complex ways, and each person's depression may have different underlying issues that need to be treated individually. We're all different people, so our makeup is very different. My depression came when I realized that I could not change who I was and that I was not able to participate actively in the church that I was going to. I was welcome, but I could not offer a prayer, partake of communion, and other of the functions that being a full member brings. The shame was brought up because of the environment as well. And it affected my well-being. As a result, I left the church. I left Christianity for about 15 years. I decided not to go to church anymore. I finally started coming back I would say about 10 years ago. And I started out at Claremont. And then from there I said, well, I don't know, I decided that I wanted to get a Master's of Divinity. So I went to Claremont School of Theology. And then I had to find an internship, right? And so I visited First Christian Church Pomona a couple of times, and I thought, well, I think I can belong here. I think I could be here. As you can tell, religious life is part of who I am. It is part of my DNA. Something calls me here. I am glad that I went to therapy. In fact, I go back when I need a tune-up. Just like Aaron said, we need to manage what's going on with our lives, our feelings. I'm glad that I took the medication. And I'm glad that it is available if I ever need it again. Just like we have our yearly physical checkup, we should consider having a mental health checkup each year to see where we are. Our bodies, our minds, it's interconnected. Our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors are all interconnected. We need to be well. Today, I read the scripture about Jesus healing the blind man. Not only was Jesus able to restore this man's sight, but Jesus gives credit to this man by telling him that his faith had made him well. Our faith in the resources that God has placed on earth for us, that we can take advantage of, with medications, therapies, support groups, whatever's out there. I believe that these resources were given by God. Accessing those resources and our faith in God is what's going to make us well. And I know that we can walk with God, and He is with us, even in our darkest moments.
Please join me in this litany of naming. It is on the screen and also in your bulletins. On this Mental Health Sunday, we join in this litany of naming. As a congregation, we are glad to lift up our voices and our spirits to break the silence that often happens when we are confronted with mental illness. As a faith community, we name the gifts and often unnamed experience which come to us in those who live with a mental illness such as major depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, substance use and addiction disorders, historic and generational trauma, racial trauma, grief, and eating disorders, and so many more. We name the hope which upholds our spirit through honest sharing, the pain when people turn away because of fear, the courage to speak in a safe place, the way that Jesus spoke truth with love, the strength from being with others who listen compassionately, the isolation that comes when no one knows what to say, the realization that mental illnesses and brain disorders can be managed, the exhaustion that comes from living with a mental illness as well as for those who are caregivers. The welcome of mental health is part of the church's ministry and outreach. The wisdom that comes when we become educated about mental health. The spirituality that comes when we walk alongside those who show both resilience and vulnerability in their lives affected by mental illness. We receive these gifts that we have named, those which are welcomed and those that are challenged. We come before you, our God, knowing that we are not alone and that you will show us a way to be and live. Amen.